Okay, chapter 14. It happened the next evening at dusk, at the time of day when people went for walks or lingered outside the mess hall after supper to talk. The air was peaceful and still, waiting for the quiet of night after a harsh day of heat and wind. Yuki and her mother stood with Emmy's grandmother, admiring the new tree that had just been planted outside the mess hall. For several weeks now, Samuel, just follow along, truckloads of volunteers had gotten permission to go out with picks and shovels to a river bank far beyond the barbed wire fence to bring back gravel for surfacing the roads and saplings to plant throughout the camp. All the broad fire banks were to be lined with saplings, and each block was to have a larger tree in front of its mess hall. "Won't it be lovely to have some green in the spring?" Mother asked, looking up at the tree and picturing the pool of shade it would provide one day. Mrs. Korihara looked doubtful. "If it can survive the dust and the wind and the alkaline soil," she said. For once she was inclined to agree with her husband, who gave the tree only a month to live. "Better look down at the ground than at that pathetic tree," he said, and he had gone off to get Mr. Tota for their usual after-supper arrowhead hunt. The two old men had become fast friends, and even if they found no arrowheads at all, still they enjoyed the daily walks in companionable silence. They were walking farther and farther from the center of camp now, searching along the southern borders of the campsite. Mrs. Korihara invited Yuki and Mother to come see the red wool material she'd found at the camp's newly opened cooperative store. "I'm going to sew Emmy a dress to welcome her home," she explained, holding the cloth up in front of her own face. "It's beautiful," Mother said, fingering the soft wool. "Emmy-chan will look lovely in it." Yuki looked hopeful at Mrs. Korihara. "Does that mean Emmy's coming home soon?" she asked. "I'm hoping she will," Mrs. Korihara answered. "If I act as though she's coming home, then I believe she really will." Emmy's grandmother believed that she could make things happen by willing them to, and she was determined to get Emmy home from the hospital by sheer will. She folded the cloth carefully and gave it a little pat as though Emmy were already inside it. It was at that moment that Mr. Tota came bursting into the room without even knocking. His eyes were wild, and he could scarcely speak from having run so hard. "Something terrible has happened," he gasped. "Your husband, Mr. Korihara, he's been shot." Yuki thought Mr. Tota had gone clean out of his mind. She'd never seen him look so distraught. His face was flushed, his hair was disheveled, and he acted as though he had gone mad. "It happened by the fence," he went on, holding his hand against his heaving chest. "The guard in the watchtower, he shot him." Amy's grandmother stood there, unbelieving, as though she were hearing out the impossible dream of a frightened child. "Sit down, old man, you're trembling," she said gently. "Now what is it? What happened? What are you saying?" If the block manager hadn't come in just then to ask about a faulty stovepipe, they might all have simply sat there believing that Mr. Tota had lost his mind completely. The block manager, however, listened carefully to Mr. Tota's story. The two old men had been walking along the southern fringe of camp close to the barbed wire fence that ringed the barracks. Their heads were down and they searched the ground. Suddenly there had been a shot, and Mr. Korihara had crumpled to the ground just as he was reaching for an interesting stone. The guard said he'd shouted from the watchtower to halt. "But we heard nothing at all," Mr. Tota said bleakly. The commotion that followed was so enormous that Yuki scarcely remembered what happened. The room suddenly filled with people, and Emmy's grandmother was hurried into a truck and driven to the hospital. She was gone for several hours, and when at last she returned, she stopped by at the Sakane barrack before she went to her own. "He is dead," she said simply, and she slumped down into a chair by the stove, unable to say anything more. She looked as though she were living in a nightmare. Mother put an arm around her shoulder to comfort her, trying to think of the right words to say. "He was a victim of the war, Mrs. Korihara," she said at last. "Just as surely as the brave boys who are dying in the Pacific, he is at peace now and won't ever have to suffer again." Mrs. Korihara nodded, but Yuki wasn't sure she'd heard. "Does Emmy know?" she asked softly. She wondered if Emmy, lying in another bed in the hospital, knew that her grandfather had died nearby. It was only when Yuki spoke Emmy's name that Mrs. Korihara sat up and spoke clearly. "Emmy-chan knows," she says quietly. "And it was your Kenichi who helped me to tell her. He was very helpful and kind at the hospital," she said. And as though the thought of Kin's help had given her some strength, she gathered herself up and said she would go back now to her own room. Mother and Yuki walked home with her and offered to make a pot of tea and stay with her. But the old woman shook her head. "I'm all right now," she said slowly. "Everything will be all right."